And yeah, I want to open it up with Mindy to kind of just give us like a brief sense of where we're at in California demographically and in that, you know, how it ties into the politics.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. In our living room, huh? Why would
Yeah.
Well, I'm dressed pretty comfy
Well, I
today,
always tell people it's like, well, if you're trying to explain this, you know, to your mom or something, like.
Sure. And I'm actually going to focus a little bit more on the recent turnout results. So
Great.
Today we're all here to talk about the 2018 election, but to dissect it, right, to do the postmortem. And this is always a fantastic conference to have those conversations. A very important thing to talk about is turnout, not just the overall turnout for the population, which we all know was very high in November, but how did it break out? Was it high for everybody? And particularly, specifically, the question of representation. So usually higher turnout means a more representative electorate, meaning that you narrow the gap in turnout rates across race, ethnicity, age, and other groups. But was that the case? What did it actually look like, and what did it mean, bottom line, for representation? Did we become a more representative electorate? Because if you didn't know, right, well, I'll answer the question. The short of it is, we're not a representative electorate, of course. We have never been, in California's history, or in any given election, whether it's high turnout or low turnout, we have a pool of actual voters that are participating, right? The voters in that election is older, whiter, wealthier, better educated than the population as a whole, and also even just the eligible voter population as a whole. So, so really the question is, at any given election, if we have high turnout, did we close that gap? Did we become, if not fully representative, because we're not there yet, did we become more representative, did we see less underrepresentation? Make sense? Okay, and that I'll talk about in just a moment. I'd like to set the stage a little bit more in terms of 2018. And why this all matters, by the way, again, we're breaking out the election, but turnout and representation, we're talking about, you know, the gubernatorial race in a little while and the 7 districts that were flipped by Democrats in another panel, but really who were those voters? Were those voters making those decisions, selecting the elected officials that now are going to be representing all of us? Were they selected by a group of folks that were representative? Or at least, again, was it at least a little bit better in terms of representation in the past? So to set the stage for 2018, you all know this is a savvy group here every time we have this election or this conference, but you know, there was a lot of speculation going into 2018 for both the primary and the general around what turnout would look like. Most of it geared around how would that impact what race? You know, would it have an impact in the battle for the control of Congress, that sort of thing. But still, we saw a lot of speculation, particularly around the Latino vote, the question around, you know, would there be a Trump effect? A lot of speculation around the youth vote, particularly in the wake of the Parkland shooting. I know I fielded a lot of media calls, and I'm sure all of our panelists did, asking, you know, was this going to be the year of the youth vote? Was this going to be the year the Latinos could help flip the districts in California or potentially elsewhere? As I had those conversations, I said at least that there were a lot of good signs to say that this would be a good turnout year, and that should mean that it would be a good turnout year for underrepresented groups. But I also was concerned about expectations. So every election we have some sort of speculation, right, around is this going to be the year for Latinos or something like that. And expectations, how we set those, making sure that they're realistic, is very, very important. And when we look at comparable elections, so presidential to presidential or midterm to midterm, and we talk about high turnout or low turnout, we're typically only talking about a few percentage points difference between what is a high turnout or low turnout, right? Most of you know that. And so as I would talk to reporters, sometimes you would hear, or other folks that would ask me questions, sometimes you would hear that the level of expectation was just way beyond, right, what we'd all love what we'd love to see, but probably what was very unlikely, right? We'd have to see a record and then some. So that's, and then not only was there speculation around the Trump effect and things like that, but we also had really high registration rates. Some of the highest registration rates we've seen in decades for a gubernatorial election, and of course the highest number, a record number of registrants in California. But at the same time, back to expectations, we also had continuing disparities in those registration rates. So whereas for the total population we were nearly 80% 78% going into the election. And the registration rate is the percent of those who are eligible to register who actually are registered. But Latinos, it was about 68%. For Asian Americans, it was about 57%. And these are numbers that we've calculated at my shop. For youth, age 18 to 24, it was a little over 60%, the highest that I've ever seen it in terms of registration rate, so exciting, but still a huge gap compared to that 78%. So even though we do have same-day voter registration, essentially, in California, there are limits to it, of course, and people are still learning that it exists. So essentially, we went into the election after the close of registration with a lot of people that couldn't register, right, or thought they couldn't register. I'm sorry, they couldn't vote or thought they couldn't vote because they didn't know about same-day registration. So I wanted to set that stage. So what did we see in 2018? So yes, it was a high year. You all know it was the highest eligible turnout rate since 1982. That's reported from the Secretary of State's office. We saw a lot of press around that. That's exciting. That was actually 50%, if you don't know the specific number. Probably we want to all see more than that, but 50% eligible turnout rate, and this is the percent of those eligible to vote, adult citizens who voted, is high, right, for a midterm year. For Latinos, and we just recently crunched these numbers, we have a report coming out that'll go into more depth. I'll just give you a few numbers today to hopefully inform the conversation a little bit. But for Latinos, instead of 50%, it was 36% eligible turnout rate, 33% for Asian Americans. Youth, 27%, 27.5% specifically, age 18 to 24. Now that might be disappointing, 27.5% for youth, when there was a lot of speculation around youth. But again, we have to think about what the range of possibility is, right? What is a good year? Of course, we all want to push that range. But in 2014, which is a bad year to compare because it was a record low turnout year, only 31% of all eligible voters actually voted. But the youth number for age 18 to 24 in that election, a number that I mentioned here at the conference 4 years ago, well, at a different location, but was only 8%. Only 8% of eligible youth in 2014 in that general election actually voted. 8%, yeah, wow, that was every time I gave that number.
So more than triple.
So now it's 27%. We expected progress. We knew we wouldn't be anywhere near, God, at least we all hoped we wouldn't be anywhere near those record low numbers, right, for the state. Everybody improved. Underrepresented groups improved. But let's talk about the percent of the vote. Let's go back to, did we get a more representative electorate, right? So gaps in turnout rates, and I won't go into the weeds, but the disparities in turnout rates help produce an electorate, right, where each group that has lower turnout rates has a lower share of all voters in that election, right, that doesn't match up to their share of the eligible voter population or the overall voter population. So in 2018, we did see some pretty good numbers. So Latinos, 36% eligible turnout rate, but 21% of the vote. In the 2016 presidential election, it was 22%. So we got close to a presidential year in terms of share of the vote. It was 15% in 2014. Now we also have some slight population growth that's happened, right, obviously since 2016, but still. For young people, they were 3% of all voters with that really low turnout rate, 3% of all voters in 2014. And they were a little over 7%, 7.2% in the November 2018 election. I want to make sure I'm being clear on my elections. So there's progress in terms of having an electorate, right, that there's been a share of the growth amongst underrepresented, but still significant disparities that remain. And I think I'll leave it there just for time.
That's great.
And I know we're going to, hopefully at some point, we'll also talk about some of the changes and what we might expect in the future, too.
Yeah, definitely. I want to get to that. So Lisa, I know you have some numbers in front of you. I'm curious if you can sort of just put into context like your impressions of what, these demographics. And, I think more broadly, we've seen just the demographics of California change, right, in recent years. And of course, that impacts the electorate. Clearly, it's still not as representative. But what's your sense of how this has impacted the political parties, both this year and looking forward? Because we're already in 2020, as we all know.
We're going to have a new Democratic candidate every day for the next
365
days. So as Marisa said, she asked me to talk about the parties. I wanted to provide a little bit of context, though. The first is that demography is not destiny, right? It is not automatically true that because I am a Latina, I'm a Democrat. right? If I am a Democrat, it's actually for historical and political reasons, right? It's not just because being a member of a certain group means you're going to vote in a particular kind of way. And in particular, there was some discussion earlier after the November election that the changes, the 16-year-old pre-registration and the other changes that have been put into place to try to get more youth to vote were actually, against the Republican Party. And just to say, if youth happen to vote Democratic, it's because the policies that those elected officials are advocating appeal to those youth. And the other party could, in fact, adopt policies that appeal to those youth too. It's not automatic that people are going to vote in a particular kind of way. So when I talk about these differences, we have to appreciate that there are policy and political reasons why people are attaching themselves to parties in a particular way. But I think the bigger message, at least in California, is that there's a little bit of a pox on both their houses as far as the electorate goes, of people being disenchanted with both. And I'm going to give you some numbers on that. But just to give folks, I think a lot of people just don't realize, especially as we think about the work our county registrars do with every election, how many voters we have in California. So this is as of last night. I'm going to say I wanted to give you fresh data, and not that I procrastinated to put these numbers together, but we have 19.9 million registered voters in the state of California. That is a massive, massive number of people that we have to deal with. And 6.5 million of them have registered since November 2016. So again, we also tend to treat voters as this kind of fixed, static thing. But in fact, the voter file is changing all the time, and it's shifting all the time, particularly with people who move a lot in immigrant communities. They're constantly coming in, going out, all those things. So just to appreciate, these are dynamic numbers that are going to move around. But right now, overall, among all registered voters, you have a 19-point gap between Democrat and Republican registration. So basically 43% of those 19.9 million people are registered Democrats, 24% are registered Republicans. We now have a situation where we have more people registered declined to state than Republicans in the state of California. So 28% of those are registered Republicans. But there are significant differences across groups. The other caveat I'm going to say, this is all data from Political Data Inc. They've been a tremendous partner to us at IGS, and so they have very high quality data for California, but there are some problems with it. So I'm going to say who Latino voters are. I'm going to say what Black voters registration looks like, but we have to know that those numbers are quite imperfect because it's all imputed, right? You don't put your race when you register to vote, and so they have to figure it out. White for political data is not African American, Asian, or Black, which is not the most perfect measure. So all of what I'm saying has some caveats in terms of those things. But right now, the gap between Democratic and Republican registration in the state of California overall is 40 points among Latinos, 58 points among African Americans, 19 points among Asians, and then 9 among whites. Again, white being a very imperfect category. But the most important thing, I think, is that somewhere between 25 and 40% of people are declined to state. And so just don't choose either party. Looking at the people who've registered most recently, because I think that's really about what the change is, you've got a 22-point gap between Democrat and Republican registration among those 6.5 million people who registered since November of 2016. The gap is slightly smaller for Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans, so 35 versus 40, just to talk about Latinos, and I don't want to throw around too many numbers because I know, especially at this time of the day, it makes your eyes cross. Part of that large number of decline to state with new registrants may be due to the way that automatic voter registration works, which is a two-stage process. So if you go to the DMV and you get automatically registered, you have to proactively then go and choose a party. And you don't get asked that in the first round. And so it may be that many people who registered just don't take that second stage.
But this was already, decline to states were growing
no,
before
it isn't
motor
growing.
voter.
I'm just saying some piece
totally.
of that might be just that piece, but it is suggestive of, when you've got basically 36% of the new registrants declined to state versus 40% choosing the Democratic Party. California isn't blue or red. Maybe we should call it yellow or green, or I don't know what we're gonna, well, green I guess is a party, but we should call it something else because most people, a good, significant, and growing proportion of people aren't aligning themselves to either party. And I think that suggests possibility for movement if one party or the other starts to sort of think about how they talk about policy, what kinds of candidates they bring forward to actually change that dynamic. So I think, we need to remember that California was Reagan country in the 80s. Latinos were close to evenly split in terms of Democratic, Republican in the early 90s, right? These are political and historical processes that are really about the positions that parties are taking. And so to appreciate that it's not fixed in time, and there's some real concerns about people's attachment to both right now.
So Dan, I want to talk to you as our no party preference expert. I don't know, but we've seen these numbers improve or increase over time, but we've also seen, when you ran for Secretary of State as no party preference, you were unsuccessful. We saw Steve Poizner fall short, who had the name ID, who had the money in the insurance commissioner race. What does that tell you about when you look at these numbers and kind of think about that, about these voters? Because in the GOP, but we can get to that, but because I think there's a sense that, they're no party preference, maybe they skew one way or the other, but it's not a monolithic group in any way, right?
Not in the slightest. And actually, if you look at the trajectory of the two races that you just cited, Marisa, in 2014, I drew 9% of the vote in a primary against opponents of both parties. Last year, Steve Poizner drew 47% of the vote.
It was close.
So the good news is, if you do the arithmetic, by the year 2022, the next no party preference candidate ought to receive 85% of the vote in the state of California. And while that's a little bit ambitious, we can come back to some of the obstacles for that. Before I go any further, though, I want to take a moment, as Marisa did, to thank our host. I've had the privilege of being associated with the Institute of Governmental Studies for more than 20 years now. And Ethan and Lisa do an amazing job here in all sorts of ways. But one way in particular I want to point to is when I first came to one of these conferences in 1990, virtually every panelist on every panel was a white man. And when I sat down
and
on
now
the
you're
stage,
outnumbered.
I realized I am happily outnumbered because I demographically represent the cohort of angry old white men in the state of California. And I'll do my best to
So
suppress
we'll hold him responsible for
I'll
it.
try to suppress at least the anger for the time being. But all joking aside, the Institute not only does incredible work substantively, but the fact that it has recognized the changing reality of California demography and politics, this panel here is a testament to it. And I'm very pleased to be a token on the panel with these four really, really smart people.
But Dan, I have to interrupt. You do not represent the angry portion of that demographic for sure.
Hey, he's just getting started.
True.
Let's see how that goes. Okay? But all joking, I do want to get back to your question. There is a common misperception about independent voters, whether self-described, whether formally registered as no party preference here in California or declined to state elsewhere. And that common misperception is that independent is a synonym for moderate. Mm-hmm. Right. So a couple of things. First of all, getting back to the angry thing, I'm not moderate about anything. The reason I'm a no party preference voter is because I'm fiercely conservative on some issues and equally fiercely liberal on others. If anything, centrism is just sort of an average. But taking myself out of this equation, most smart people in both parties will correctly point out to you that while there are a few centrist, moderates, whatever you want to call me, like me, wandering the NPP landscape, the overwhelming majority of independent voters are ideologically indistinguishable on a left-right spectrum from traditional Democrats and traditional Republicans. The overwhelming majority of no party preference voters here and independent voters nationally are either just as liberal as most Democrats or just conservative as most Republicans, but there is a really important ideological differentiator. It doesn't come on a left-right scale, but rather on an outside-in scale. What causes someone to register as an independent is not because they reject the two parties for being too liberal or too conservative. What causes someone to withdraw from the two major parties is rather a hostility, an antipathy, and often an anger toward the two parties, toward politics as usual, toward government. And so you watch as we sit here on the eve of the Howard Schultz administration, That's a. And what's interesting to me about it is that he has, at least early on, staked his claim as an independent as a centrist. Now, there is some overlap. Some people are angry because one party is too liberal and the other party is too conservative. But what will be interesting to me in watching Schultz go forward is, number one, does he not replace, but pair that centrism with two things? Number one, a particular policy issue, as Ross Perot did many, many years ago, emphasizing the federal deficit in a way that neither Democrats or Republicans of that era did. And number two, can he give voice to that hostility and to that anger? I think, like I said, independents aren't independent because they're moderate. They're independent because they're dissatisfied. Right. And we'll see going forward whether Schultz or others can tap into that dissatisfaction. To date, ironically enough, the people who are most successful at tapping into that dissatisfaction and hostility come from the extremes of the two parties.
Yeah,
And we'll
I
come
think
back
that's
to
the
that later,
important
but
point,
Bernie
yeah.
Sanders and Donald Trump, in all sorts of ways, tend to.
There's a Venn diagram there, right?
Well, they're much more, probably have a lot more in common than either one of them would care to admit.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important point, and I think, I mean, we could spend the hour talking about Howard Schultz and all the candidates, but I think that, like, that's something I'm watching too, is just this idea that being a centrist, I mean, both Trump and Sanders, tapped into this populism and this anger and this dissatisfaction with both parties as well, even though they were running as, representatives of each party, and I think that there's a sort of very small window there, but we don't have to go too deep into that.
Before Kristin takes over, just
Yeah.
to that point, there's an old saying in politics that there's no such thing as a raging moderate.
Right.
And so, no question, what both Sanders and Trump did very adroitly is recognize that the greatest hostility and anger came from the bases of the two parties, not to the center. It's not to say that it can't be done from the center, we'll see, but certainly, Sanders and Trump demonstrated where that turf is most fertile.
Well, that's actually a great segue to Kristin, because I think she's been very turned off by those far wings of both parties, but you've been very vocal in a time where I think people have really retreated to their political corners way more. And so, you recently warned that the GOP in California is dying, and I think that, the registration numbers are sobering, but the numbers in the state legislature are even worse for Republicans. Right. Can you just talk a little bit about what you mean by that and what you think the party should do? Is it an opening for a third party, which, frankly, history doesn't show us that there's a lot of opportunity there, or should the party sort of rise like a phoenix and rebuild itself?
Yeah, great questions, and it seemed more simple in the aftermath of the election, actually, than it does today, because we've spent a lot of time hypothesizing about these issues and figuring out the path forward, and it just becomes more complex, not more simple. And so we could talk all day about that one particular question. But this is not something that took place overnight. The fact is, in the last 2 decades, Republican registration in California has declined by 12%. And it is, to some extent, tied to demographics. In those same time periods of the last 2 decades, the white population in California has declined by roughly the same percentage. So demographics are clearly having an impact on registration, for better or for worse. I do agree with Lisa, though, that either party has an opportunity to present policy solutions and ideas and demonstrate a way to resonate with voters that can overcome demographics if they choose to do so. And the Republican Party in the last couple of decades has failed to adapt to those changing demographics, has failed to participate in outreach programs that build relationships with California's changing demographics, which has led to its decline. And then what we saw in the 2018 elections was, in my opinion, its ultimate death. I believe the party today is dead in California. In the California State Assembly, we have fewer Republicans. I wouldn't clap about that as a long-term historical Republican who spent my whole adult life in it, but I get it. I get it. I'm just as frustrated.
Well, we just saw the last member of the San Diego GOP delegation switch
just
parties.
changed his registration
not
from
to
Republican
independent, to Democrat.
Right, not to NPP, but to Democrat.
Yeah.
So we have fewer people serving in the California State Assembly today as Republicans than we've had since the 1800s. the 1800s. John Cox, if you read things, you might hear from some individuals and organizations, John Cox performed better than all the California congressional candidates who lost their seats. Okay, that might be true, but he still got a fewer percentage of the vote than any other Republican gubernatorial candidate ever. So that is not a positive to point to, that if we're just right on the message, that we're going to succeed in elections. It's going to take a lot more than that. For a long time, many of us, or at least several of us, thought that we could demonstrate that California Republicans are different from the national brand. We thought we could rise above what I would consider a toxic national brand. 2014 and 2016, we actually had great success with that. In 2016, Catherine Baker, some of you may be familiar with that name. She represented the East Bay area. She, as a Republican candidate up for re-election, beat Donald Trump's numbers by 29% on the exact same ballot as him. In 2018, and she has been a very vocal opponent of many of Trump's behaviors and policies, she lost that race by 1% or 2%. And so that was probably the most graphic illustration that what we thought we could do, demonstrate that California Republicans are different, we simply weren't able to do in 2018. And I don't think in 2020 it's going to look much better. And so it does lead to the question then, where do we go from here? If the party in California is dead today, can it be rebuilt? Or is it time to look at another path? And I would argue the jury's still out. I am exploring both. As Marisa said, creating a new party or a new movement is a monumental task that's never been effectively done in the past. But if we look at the past, it's typically always centered around one individual or one particular policy issue. And so the question now is, are we at a unique time in history where we have a particular president who is dividing this country unlike anything I've ever seen before, a politically polarized environment where I believe the silent majority is part of the disaffected voting population that's frustrated with both parties. And at the same time, we have a growing no-party preference electorate that we don't see changing. We don't see that trajectory changing anytime soon. I call it the radical middle, although I agree with Dan, middle doesn't necessarily imply centrist on ideology. Mm-hmm. It just means the middle, the vast majority of the middle, NPP voters, disaffected Republicans, disaffected Democrats, are hungry for leadership that presents real solutions to the real problems that are plaguing our communities, our state, and our nation. And they're not finding that leadership, at least today, in either party. And so if the movement toward a new party could be broad-based with a number of individuals from both parties and from the middle for sort of a multi-party effort, a trans-party effort, if the issues that they rally around and unify around were multiple, 3 or 4 common values and policy priorities that they want to advance, and if there is a broad base of the donor community who can get behind that effort, there might be a path in California. I think it's too soon to tell, but many of us are looking to see, is there a path forward in that way where millions and millions and millions of Californians could feel represented again? Because I will tell you, there are many, I would argue most, who don't feel represented by the two parties today, one moving rightward and one moving leftward. The other option is to rebuild the party from the ground up. There is opportunity in crisis. The party, I have argued, is dead. The entire infrastructure at the California Republican Party will be changing at the end of February. The chairman is termed out. The staff is going to be changing. The executive director is leaving. The staff will be changing. And so there is potentially opportunity to rebuild if the party can wait out and outlast Donald Trump's presidency. I don't think there will be any opportunity as long as he's in the seat of the presidency. And if the number one issue is, you have to acknowledge the problem. And it is mind-boggling to me how many activists in the Republican Party, despite the 2018 election results, still do not want to acknowledge the problem that we're in. They want to double down on everything we've been doing, which has gotten worse and worse and worse election results over the last 20 years. And so if they can begin to acknowledge the problem, if they can begin to put individuals in place and spokespersons in place that can demonstrate they truly care about Californians in all regions of the state, from all demographics of the state, they can expose the problems that the current party in control has not dealt with yet and offer real solutions to those challenges, whether it's housing, homelessness, poverty, income inequality, et cetera. And they may be able to get on a path where they could become a viable second party again. And that's what I would argue Californians really need, is a viable two-party system where public policy outcomes best serve the greatest number of Californians in all regions of our state. Public policy outcomes are ultimately better when people of varying ideologies and perspectives have to work together to craft those policies. So that would be the goal I try to see, or would like to see, and I think the jury's still out, whether that's through a new movement or a new party, or whether it's through a rebuilding the California Republican Party that moves to a very different place than it's been over the last 20, 30 years.
Thanks, you guys. So I have a lot of questions, and I would love to make this conversation, so please jump in. This isn't, I mean, one thing that made me think of, because I've watched the legislature for the past 10 plus years, is what does it mean to be a Democrat or Republican these days? And you mentioned Catherine Baker. Well, she voted more reliably Democratic than some Central Valley Democrats, right? Like, and I think what we saw in 2018 was a lot of, those wobbler seats that Republicans have been able to hold in places like San Bernardino, Orange County, flip. But they're going to be up again in 2 more years, right? And so I just wonder, to any of you, like, is it possible that we almost have a two-party system within the Democratic Party, at least legislatively? Because you do have this mod caucus and business-backed Democrats who are really different than the ones who are coming from more liberal coastal areas.
I think that's a great question, Marisa. Yeah, the standing joke is California is a two-party state. They're just both Democratic parties. Yeah. and in the state legislature, to differentiate from the good grassroots work that people like Kristin are doing, the dividing line you talked about is a very stark one. I'll put it, Ace Smith, the smartest man in politics, is here today, so I'll put this in a Kamala Harris construct. Think of the two Democratic parties as one party that's excited about Kamala Harris but is concerned about her positions on criminal justice issues, and one Democratic party that's excited about Kamala Harris but concerned about eliminating private insurance. And a very progressive Democratic Party on both economic and social and cultural issues does dominate the legislature, primarily because of the lack of the ballast from a partisan standpoint that Kristin was talking about. But to me, the most important thing that's happened in state politics over the last decade was, number one, the passage of the top 2 primary, and number 2, the very smart decision of the California business community to aggressively recruit and support and fund Democrats who are very progressive on social and cultural issues, but more centrist or more pro-business on economic matters. And until the Republican Party accelerates the process that Kristin was talking about a moment ago, the biggest fights in Sacramento are between those 2 Democratic groups. That said, it's a much more visible split. But in a 2-party system, neither party is ever going to be ideologically uniform.
Right.
In Israel, in Italy, in any other place you go where there are 6, 8, 10, 12 or more parties, you have the luxury of being ideologically pristine. Any political party that's going to accomplish 50% of the vote plus 1 on a regular basis needs to make room for both of those kind of Democrats, and will ultimately need to make room for both of those kinds of Republicans.
Well, let me play devil's advocate a little bit. I mean, is that a bad thing entirely? Because what we saw during, say, your time in the legislature was a caucus that was really hard to manage for you because they were so obsessed with like a couple things, right? Like it was like no taxes ever. We won't go up on a budget vote, for example. I don't know. Is there a positive to having a big tent party that is maybe more willing to cross some of those lines at different times? And I mean, Lisa,
I think it's a positive if, and it's a big if. And I think based on my experience of the Democratic Party is they do a much better job of it than the Republican Party. I think it's a positive if there's a recognition and appreciation for the fact that there is a spectrum of ideas within one ideological party. So within the Republican Party, it should be okay and welcome that there is a spectrum of ideology from moderate to conservative on any number of given issues. The problem is that historically with the Republican Party, they would rather have tension and factions over those ideological differences and kill and try to take out each other. Instead of, when I was leader, I really worked to unify our caucus so that whether you were one of the mods or one of the conservatives, you were supporting each other because you recognized you're going to agree with each other more than 50% of the time, and probably 80% of the time. And so give each other the space to be the individual elected Republican that they wanted to be. And we were effective at that for a couple of years. But usually, they'd rather attack each other than unify in becoming stronger and being the opposition and the contrast to the Democratic Party. In the Democratic Party, they have the same type of factions. They're a growing number of factions. One of them in particular told me after the elections he'd like to jump off a cliff right now rather than go to Democratic caucus meetings because he's just going to be so frustrated all the time. But they tend to do a much better job, despite their ideological differences, of unifying in terms of opposing their Republican opponents from a policy and political perspective. And so I think it depends, but they are in a challenging times. You know, they have a 3/4 majority in the Assembly, a 2/3 majority in the state Senate. I wouldn't wish that upon any pro tem or speaker when the number of factions within Democratic ideology are growing between those who want to fight for civil rights and labor versus environmentalism, those from the San Joaquin Valley and inland California versus coastal California. And I think the geographic differences that those in the Democratic caucuses are facing are becoming more prevalent, not less. And the last piece I'll add, similar to what Dan said about the business community seeking out candidates within the Democratic Party that they can support that are more pro-jobs, pro-business. I'm seeing now candidates who are thinking about running for state office who may have been Republican at one time or may be NPP at one time are going to run as Democratic candidates, even though historically their ideological positions might be more reflective of Republican philosophy. They feel they have a better electoral opportunity running on the Democratic ticket and then can represent their ideological positions within that caucus. We'll see if that ends up being a fruitful effort, but it's interesting to see that shift taking place.
Well, I want to bring you guys back in. You want to?
Just one quick point on it before we get too far away from this conversation. Talking about the no party preference, the growth in no party preference, which has been slowly rising the last decade or so in California. The thing about no party preference is voters that register as no party preference vote in lower turnout achieve lower turnout numbers.
Is that because they're not being talked to as much?
Well, a lot of reasons. Bear with me for a moment. So just to be clear, in any given election, typically turnout, not looking at anything else, just party affiliation. Voters that are registered as no party preference are going to have 10, 11 percentage points lower than those that are registered as Democrats or Republicans, and some variation there. And it's because I think there's a self-selection process, as we already talked a little bit, in terms of people feeling disconnected from the political process, from political parties, I should say, specifically. And also, by definition, they're not signed up with a party, and they're not getting the contact and outreach and mobilization as much. And a lot of parties, of course, or a lot of candidates and campaigns have been trying to figure out better strategies at reaching no party preference voters, but still by definition they're not as connected. So the lack of choice in that sense, where voters find themselves, has real implications in terms of our overall turnout numbers, just the level of engagement in our elections when we have a big chunk of folks that are participating in lower numbers. And even as we talk about these factions or whatever we want to call them within the party, of course the reality is how much of that actually the everyday voter is aware of, right?
Yeah.
And it can swing either way. It can be confusing and turn voters off. It also could be, oh, now I found my slice, right, like in multi-party systems around the world. Now I found what interests me, but the average voter doesn't necessarily hear all that or doesn't know what to make of it.
They're not watching Cal Channel as much as I am.
Yeah,
That's
I know.
so crazy.
It's a little crazy, and the bottom line is we often have less engagement.
Right.
So
Well, they
choice
don't-
matters.
Yeah, Lisa, I
and
mean, they don't know what
outreach
to do
matters.
with
Just
us,
really
right?
quickly, because I agree with Dan, except I do want to emphasize that no party preference, at least among immigrant origin voters, isn't necessarily a rejection. It's just people not feeling comfortable enough with the system to be able to pick. And so to appreciate that there's also that part of not angry, but just confused. And the fact that the bigger the tent for Democrats, the more confusing it becomes, right? Party preference is a heuristic that people use as a shortcut to say if you're a Democrat, it means you need these things. If you're a Republican, you meet. So as those things fudge, it becomes much more difficult for voters to understand. And our stuff is already really complicated. And so just to appreciate it just makes it harder and harder for people to know what they can trust in terms of information about who should be the person that they're supporting.
Well, do you guys have any sense then, both in terms of how, what this means for elections and then also for campaigns? Because, okay, so I'm a no party preference voter. Welcome to our party if you want to join.
I think about it every day of every week.
And I think what I see is like very confused mail from campaigns because they try to target me through other means, and I've actually talked to people. So for example, I have lived in a rent-controlled apartment for 10 years, and I got all this mail during the Prop 10 debate as if I was a homeowner. Because, and I talked to one of the consultants, he's like, yeah, well, look at your age, your education level, like your income, like we assumed that you.
They impute that, but this is what I'm saying about the
Yeah.
data. They have to impute you.
Right.
They don't know anything, so they're going to put
And
all
they're
of
like,
this
this will
third-party
drive down
data on
housing
you.
prices. And I'm like, awesome, maybe I'll buy a no. No, but, so, I mean, what are the pitfalls there then? Because it seems like.
Because it's flawed. These are not perfect algorithms,
Yeah.
right? Algorithms, garbage in, garbage out is the same principle, whether it's an algorithm or any other thing. And so they're going to see what magazines you buy. They're going to buy third-party marketing data. They're going to see who you live with and whether you live with somebody. So, PDI has all of these like Democratic Plus, Democratic Plus Plus, all of these
Right.
different ways to try to impute information onto you. And then if it's wrong, you either laugh or you think that they're all crazy, right?
Yeah.
Because they're sending you the wrong thing.
I think one
so
of the
the data's a
challenges with
big
that
issue.
too, though, is you have traditional Republican political consultants and traditional Democratic political consultants speaking to the NPP voter as if they know them as well as those traditional Republican and Democratic voters. They aren't the same. And so there's been some talk lately about whether candidates should begin to hire multiple different political consultants who have expertise and understanding of different voting demographics in order to speak more effectively to this growing no party preference voter. It's a tricky task, particularly for Republican consultants, because if Republicans are only talking to Republicans, we all know what's going to happen, right? It's just going to be more of the same. So they have to learn how to start talking to other people. And traditional Republican political consultants may not be the best ones suited to be able to do that effectively, particularly with that MPP voter.
But if I can just say, and apologies to all the political consultants in the room, even the Democratic and Republican consultants aren't always good at talking to their own party people.
Oh, yeah.
Just to say,
Fair enough.
right?
Fair
They
enough.
aren't necessarily
Yeah. Fair
able to
enough.
have the nuance they need to actually get beyond kind of the likely voter within their tent.
Yeah, and what I wanted to add was, it's just also just stepping back, the overarching approach, trying to find those likely voters. It's a entrenched reality in our political system, right? Campaigns and candidates, we've talked about this often, campaigns and candidates use for the most part, the likely voter model to strategically utilize their resources to, biggest bang for their buck to reach those people. Highest likelihood that when they reach them, they're gonna turn out. But that approach, the data is flawed, but that approach also leaves out huge swaths of potential voters, right? Which in our state are more likely to be of color and younger people. That if they got that connection, particularly if it was in a more thoughtful, more sustained way, which we could talk about too, that they will turn out. And much of Lisa's research has shown that they will turn out if they are contacted in a sustained, meaningful way. But because we for the most part, use that likely voter model, or just not even, and actually lots of survey research shows the underrepresented groups, election in, election out, report not getting, even registered voters report not getting that outreach. And it's a huge lost opportunity, but it's also part of what adds to that underrepresented electorate, right? Which is a
The
negative for all of
mailboxes
us.
are happy, but they're not.
Yeah.
Well,
so I just have to make that point.
But to
does this-
concretize the level that I did a back of the envelope for Latino voters in the state of California. If you add together the unregistered and the folks that aren't between 70 and 100 in terms of the voting models, so the people who are going to be contacted either by mail or it's 80% of Latino voters
Wow. Well, is
fall
that
outside of what campaigns.
does that
talk
mean that
to.
the 2018 turnout is good news then? Because
Yes, means
folks,
that we went
if you bring
beyond.
more people in, more people will be part of those calculations.
Yeah, because once people are in, then they're
Then they're getting talked to,
then
right?
their
Ability to
likelihood
engage,
goes
Then,
yeah.
up,
then the
right?
campaigns are buying their data. So
But it also means we still have a lot of
work to
go.
do.
Right.
Yes,
And we haven't solved the problem.
because you've got new people coming in all the time.
yeah.
Well, right, to that point, like how much of, when we talk about the changing percentages of the parties, how much of it is people actually switching parties? How much of it is new voters? How much of it is, are people moving here? Like, did the Republican Party actually see people leave it in the last couple of years, or did people just die?
Yes.
I think
Both.
20 years. It's 20 years. I mean, your time
So-
horizon has to be longer than that.
Yeah, it's the old line. How did you lose your fortune? And so it's gradually and then all at once. I think you could make the same case here. In 2018, married, female, college-educated voters abandoned the Republican Party in extraordinary numbers and elected a Democratic House of Representatives. I'm not brave enough to predict an outcome of the 2020 election. I gave up on political predictions
We
in
all did.
2016. But I would argue that a female candidate, whether Harris or Gillibrand or Warren or Tulsi Gabbard or Amy Klobuchar, starts with a built-in advantage, given both that shift and that motivation. But it happened gradually and all at once. My favorite quote is from Mark Twain: "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And for those of us who are old enough to remember in the 1990s when smart Democrats like Bill Clinton and Dianne Feinstein began talking about soccer moms, they were talking about precisely the same demographic. Suburban voters, soccer moms and soccer dads, who are economically successful, but socially moderate to liberal, who Clinton and other Democrats convinced to deprioritize their economic interests to vote on social and cultural matters. At the same time that smart Democrats like Clinton and Feinstein were moving the soccer parents in one direction, fewer of you may remember the term NASCAR dad. The Republicans began to reach out to NASCAR dads and NASCAR moms, economically blue-collar, socially conservative voters who shifted. Two quick statistical point, and then I'll shut up. Throughout modern history, the single most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior for years, for decades, was income. The more money you made, the more likely you were to vote Republican. The less money you made, the more likely you were to vote Democrat. And because of that massive trade, the soccer moms for NASCAR dads, in 2004, during the Bush-Kerry election, it was the first time in modern political history in which income was not the primary determinant of partisan voting behavior. What replaced it in 2004 and is articulated since is what's called religiosity. Not your religious faith, but rather the intensity of it and the frequency with which an individual attends church or synagogue makes them much more likely to vote Republican. Those who do it on a less frequent basis are much more likely to vote Democrat. I'm not judging either way. Like Jon Stewart, I say I'm not that religious, I'm just sort of Jewish. But the cultural and social determinants have forced and accelerated that massive trade-off. And in 2018, you saw, frankly, the daughters of those original soccer moms turning the House Democratic.
Oh, well, that
So
kids,
I'll
I want to get
answer
to
your
that.
question.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
So I
say,
just wanted
Can
to
you-
do a quick
yeah,
addendum
yeah.
to that, just because, but everything you said is true for white voters. And so I think we need to remember white women have voted Democratic once in a presidential election since 1948. They split 50-50 in 2018. So those women who supported the Democrats are actually women of color. So we need to remember not all women. And beyond that, religiosity also doesn't map on to folks of color. Janelle Wong from Maryland has a wonderful new book on that even evangelical Asians and Latinos have less conservative social positions than white evangelists. So even religiosity. So we have to be really much more nuanced about thinking about how all of these different lines map. And the thing that is most aligned with Republican Party identification now is being white. And so appreciating that race and party intersect in important ways that aren't natural, that are political products, but have real meaningful outcomes.
Marisa, can I
Which
just add
also
one point
speaks-
quickly to address Lisa's statement, because she's exactly right. I didn't ignore minority voters because they're not a critical piece of the electorate, but because they're not swing voters. Until the Republican Party becomes more competitive in addressing the concerns of African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific voters, the primary challenge for Democratic political strategists is not one of persuasion, but of motivation. So that wasn't to minimize their import, but rather in talking about the context of voters who have in recent history been available to both voters, but
It was a
point
friendly
well
amendment.
taken.
Yeah.
Point
Well,
well
to
taken.
speak to Lisa's point, though, that also provides both opportunity and risk for both parties, right? That shows there is opportunity. But back to what's happening to the Republican voter, I think it's all three. They are dying, right? If you look at the age demographics of how people are registering, Republican voters are absolutely dying. They are moving, and they are re-registering, or if not re-registering, they are at least voting differently in their patterns. Jeff Denham's race, for example, his re-election for Congress, that's the area I live in, and it was clear if you look at his election results in terms of the numbers, Republicans in our community voted against Jeff. And so not only are they dying, moving, and re-registering, but they're even voting differently, many of them who are staying Republicans, at least for now.
Mindy?
Great conversation. The only thing I appreciate the friendly amendment you made. The only thing that I would add to it is just the California context, and I think, Lisa, you touched on this earlier, but just in this conversation, we can't deny the last 20 years and the change over time that we've seen, with regard to how particularly Latinos, but many Californians have viewed the Republican Party, and a lot of that came out of Proposition 187, which I think we actually haven't mentioned yet today.
No.
And much of the growth in the Democratic Party has been driven, not all of it, but driven by changes in Latino registration, going more Democrat. Although not
And Asian American.
Well,
yes,
yeah,
and
I want to
Asian
talk
American as
about
well, but
Asian
sheer
Americans.
sheer numbers in terms of Latinos, but definitely Asian American as well, both together.
Yeah.
And Latinos themselves are not a monolithic group. African Americans are more skewed Democratic in terms of their registration, but still you've got a decent percentage of Latinos that are NPP. But the dynamics that have happened over the last 20 years.
29%, if we want to be
Yeah,
precise. 53% Democratic.
they've been fluctuating a lot, actually.
That's
just
a huge
over the
change.
last 3
That's a
elections.
huge change.
Yeah. So that dynamic is part of our history, and it's part of not just how voters see themselves and potentially how they engage, but also the organizing dynamic in the state. 187 gave us a little bit of a bump in terms of Latino turnout in '94. We didn't see a sustained bump after that. We're hoping we're seeing some sort of change now, but turnout disparities stayed roughly the same over the last couple of decades. But what we did see that was sustained was the registration shifts that tremendously impacted the overall registration skew of California, but also in terms of it created a whole group of particularly young Latinos that ended up becoming leadership, within the Latino community and beyond in California to organize, to mobilize, and there was some concern the last few years before Donald Trump that maybe some of those folks were going to start dying out, and where was the next generation coming? That because being mobilized in that context is a very unique experience. But now we have Donald Trump and the Trump effect that potentially is going to give us a whole nother generation of young people that are going to be out, organizing and mobilizing and being leaders. So I just wanted to put that context in.
Well, so for me, like having covered 2018 and particularly the congressional races, which I'll just note as a journalist, it was so interesting because California historically in my 15 years or so reporting here, like we didn't play in the congressional stuff. It was just like, okay, whatever, that's happening somewhere else. We focus on the governor or this. This year, we went down to Orange County, which I think is a microcosm of a lot of the things we're talking about here. So like to Dan's point, I interviewed several, and this is anecdotal obviously, but several women who said, like basically like moms are coming out of the closet as Democrats, and I heard stories about people who are canvassing and women saying, don't tell my husband, but like I'm voting for Katie Porter, you know? And it was so fascinating because A, can you ever see a man doing that? No. Don't tell my wife, you know, like. But also, you know, I think it speaks to some of the stuff we're getting at about people who either left the party or are in it but are not as sort of tied to those. But then also within the sort of racial and ethnic makeup there, we've seen, you know, it become a more diverse county. I'm interested to talk to you guys too about like how generational differences play into this, because one thing Paul Mitchell has told me is that he really sees a difference, for example, between first generation Asian American voting patterns and second generation, which also has to do clearly with like what was happening when you immigrated with the Vietnam War and things like that. And everything ties back to Trump, right? Now he's going to start deporting Vietnamese folks, so that's probably not going to be good for Republicans in Orange County. But I mean, what do you see in that? Like,
well, I think again, we really have to think about time horizon. I appreciate Mindy bringing out that context of 187. So there are a couple people in this room that have been involved in the organizing in Orange County. That organizing started over 15 years ago, right? So that didn't just magically happen that Orange County flipped. It has been the product of sustained investment in infrastructure to bring those new young people into the system.
But there was a sense that they wouldn't really come out yet. Like nobody thought that that was a foregone conclusion now. It was more projecting.
I think people were, but I guess what I'm saying is these people, the moms don't come out of the closet magically by themselves,
no,
right?
Absolutely.
Is all I'm saying is that there's organizing. And so just thinking about differences in voting patterns, immigrant voters who were socialized, who registered during the 90s, socialized under that context of racial threat, still vote at higher rates than US-born voters. So that when you come into the system and what the context is in the system, so the young people who are coming into the system now, we can probably expect to vote at pretty high rates. And so to appreciate that history matters, context matters, but all of those conversations at the doors, the organizing on the ground, the long-term investments in infrastructures in different parts of the state do have consequences, and it's not just a Trump effect.
That's interesting.
Can I add a little bit?
Yeah.
So when you think about it, what's really unique right now, well, lots of things that are happening, but when we think about these new voters coming into the electorate, we saw a pretty high turnout in 2016, right? We saw a high turnout in 2018. We're all expecting to see probably pretty good turnout in 20.
High-ish for the United States. Can we just say it's still dismally low?
Yes.
Can we just have?
And I did make that point earlier. We'd want to see higher than 50%, of course, but high turnout for what we can expect, right? At this point, we likely will see a high turnout year in 2020. No matter what your political affiliations, I think we all hope for that. Many of the factors that were in play in it's not just Trump, but Trump and the organizing dynamic certainly in play in 2016, 2018, likely in 2020. Trump is going to be a factor no matter what. That means that we have this unique kind of situation at hand, that we could have a whole cohort of voters that typically haven't voted, that now have voted, right, not just in one election because they got galvanized, but typically when we see a bump, the bump goes away. But a sustained bump of sorts. Again, presidential is not quite comparable to midterm and so forth, but a sustained bump in the sense that we have higher turnout over more than just one election. Does that make sense? Yeah. That means that that's an opportunity, at least as I see it, a really important opportunity and a responsibility that we try to keep those voters sustained. Now, I think they're much more likely to just by patterns that we've already established that we understand, if they vote in one election, vote again, another election, vote, they're going to likely continue to vote, but also do the work to make sure that that happens.
Yeah.
That we don't let this historic opportunity kind of go away, and that it can't be just about one candidate, right, or one unique set of circumstances, that we make the case, right, as we organize and engage folks about the long-term impacts. And I think many new voters are seeing that. It's not just Trump, right, or it's not just whatever the immediate thing. It is an understanding of the importance of participating in our system, and having a voice and having power and having a say. But I think definitely in our organizing efforts as we engage folks going forward, it's to make sure that that bigger case is made for sustained engagement.
Keep that gateway drug going, first voting.
How can we possibly lose it? This is,
right.
Yeah,
well, you also hear about like how much more likely people are to vote if their parents do, and if that's something, and just civic engagement in general. I want to get you guys to weigh in on something though too, because one thing we saw in 2018 was a lot of, and not in California, well, a lot of controversy around turnout and suppression, right? So in other states like Georgia, it was allegations that the GOP was suppressing minority voters. Here, there's a sense among Republicans that all of these new voting laws are opening up the door to fraud and, that it's a bad thing, sort of. And I think, first of all, Kristin, like, isn't that sort of an inherently, bad strategy for Republicans
Absolutely.
to think people shouldn't vote?
Absolutely, right? And it's part of the weave of problems that have left Californians feeling disenfranchised by the Republican Party, right? It sends a message, we don't care about you, we don't want you to participate.
We don't want you to vote, right?
We don't want you to be part of shaping your communities. Who would want to hear that, right? And I remember when Paul Ryan decried California's ballot harvesting law, and we can talk about that, but what was the point? Right? The law's not going to change, so all he did is double down on the perception that Republicans don't want people to vote. Not helpful, not helpful. Now, having said that, there are challenges, and actually some former Democratic members of the legislature, I think, have been the most articulate, albeit more privately, encouraging to get more public, about the challenges associated with ballot harvesting in Stanislaus County, in talking with the registrar of voters there. That was an intense job, being in the 10th Congressional District. It was really tough. And she had people bringing in, one woman brought in 625 ballots. And you do have to wonder, what is going on? She got one complaint. They would get several calls, but this was the one that was startling to her, of a gentleman who called, an elderly man who called and said he felt very harassed. And they said they wanted to come into his house, help him with his ballot in his kitchen, give me your ballot and I'll take it down for you. And he just felt very uncomfortable and intimidated. Now, do I believe that happened to the extent where it had a statistically significant outcome on election results? I don't know that I would say that. But do I say it's the best way to build trust in the voting electorate and to ensure fair and objective elections? I wouldn't suggest that either. What I would suggest is decrying it sends a message that's not helpful to the growth of the party. And what I would also say is the Republican Party shouldn't have been surprised. This had been law for 2 years.
They kind of got outgamed.
And they should have been better prepared. They got outgamed, out-strategized, out-mobilized, and they should have been better prepared.
But Dan, we also just heard that a lot of voters aren't being reached. They aren't being talked to. Mm-hmm. I think one area, I actually am generally pretty pleasantly surprised with how much voters seem to, if you look at complicated ballot measures often, it's wow, people actually did the research. But one race where that did not seem to be the case was the US Senate race, where Kevin De Leon beat Dianne Feinstein in places like Del Norte and
Central
very
Valley.
red. It seemed to me like that was a vote against Feinstein, perhaps more than a vote for the author of the sanctuary law.
I think that's probably right, he says with some understatement. I think what had happened, and it's actually, I think, fairly straightforward, is Californians, Republican and Democrat, have, even if they haven't learned a lot about Dianne Feinstein over the many years she's been in office, they know enough about her to associate her with either a party they like or a party they don't. Mm-hmm. Kevin De Leon, for all of his admirable qualities, does not inspire that same association, positive or negative. So for a relatively low information voter who knows a lot about Dianne Feinstein and doesn't know anything about Kevin De Leon, think, okay, I know a Democrat says, I know I like Dianne Feinstein, I don't know who this De Leon is, so I'm going to vote for her. A Republican says, I know this Dianne Feinstein, I've been voting against her since 1990, I don't know who this De Leon is, so I'll vote for him. But I don't think there was a considered strategic approach there.
I think it's more than that. I've been looking at this a lot, and after the returns that are available today, I want to study it some more. But I think it's very reflective of the current political environment in which we're living. So I've born and raised in the San Joaquin Valley. I'm raising my kids in the San Joaquin Valley. We have been a long-term historical vote, the Central Valley that is, for Dianne Feinstein. She is viewed in our communities as somebody who's pragmatic. somebody who's been good for us on issues related to agriculture and water, somebody who's willing to work with both sides and build consensus to deliver results for Californians. That's been long-term political views of her in the Central Valley. That changed dramatically this year. And Kevin De Leon was the alternative that people could go to who had less name ID. People are much more familiar with SB 54 and the sanctuary state than they are familiar with the fact that he was the author of it. That's just not very well known within communities. And Dianne Feinstein, during the Kavanaugh hearings and during many other episodes throughout Congress this year, made a strategic decision. It didn't hurt her in the end, but made a strategic decision to move leftward in the way she communicates, in the way she carries herself. Now, that may have been a good or bad strategic political decision for her, but the fact is she did that and it was noticed. I heard about it all the time from people in the Central Valley. Like, what has happened to Dianne Feinstein? We're going to have to vote for somebody else. And it shows the political polarization that maybe they're short-term gain with for long-term loss.
I think, Marisa, I think Kristin's points are very valid. I will take a backseat to her clearly on her knowledge of Central Valley voters, and there's no question that Feinstein did some positioning. It was worth noting that a candidate who based her campaign in 1990 on her switch in support of the death penalty, for example, last year announced that she had reconsidered a decision. I'll just say this, agreeing and admiring with what Kristin has just offered, that if the voters of California had precisely the same of information available to them about Kevin De Leon as they've developed over the years about Dianne Feinstein, he would have done much better on the left and probably not nearly as well on the right.
Well, and I think to my original sort of maybe muddled point, but is that voters in your area were being communicated with a lot because of the congressional races. Voters in reliably red places like the northern and part of the state probably weren't, and so they just were sort of voting a little more blind, perhaps, than anyway. So we're going to open it up to questions. To reiterate, I'll call on you. Wait till you get the microphone. And this gentleman back there was very quick. So
I'm wondering what the panel thinks about which elements of the For the People Act of 2018 are most likely to actually make it out of Congress and be signed into law.
I believe that's HR 1. That's the voting laws.
Yes.
Isn't the better question
Political prediction.
which piece of legislation will ever make it out of Congress? I think there are lots of things that should be bipartisan and should actually be no-brainers, but I wonder if in the current context, those things that people do agree on, whether that will be possible, and then whether the president would just veto it out of spite. So I feel like there are lots of things in that bill that I think both sides could probably find common ground on, but I'm not sure the current environment makes it possible for that to happen, at least not in the short term, maybe like in the summer when people stop paying attention. But right now, especially with the 2020 race already starting, but I don't know what other people think.
Agreed.
Hi, Kristin. I'm wondering, or others, kind of what is the message or policy that you would see that would appeal to rebuild the Republican Party with either the NPP voters or other existing constituencies or among the core Democratic Party support that would sort of revitalize the Republican Party, in your view?
So I don't claim to be the holder of truth on this, but what I would suggest, I think, provides a possible roadmap would be issues surrounding affordability and economic mobility, whether that has to do with housing, whether that has to do with education opportunities, certainly income inequality between various regions of the state. But I think if the party could capture the affordability message and how the policy offerings of the party in control over the last decade or so have increased the cost of housing, have increased income inequality, have increased poverty levels, then there's an opportunity to fill that space with alternative solutions so people can see their cost of living go down and their opportunity to increase their economic opportunities goes up.
If I may, as a former Republican, once again, I think Kristin's exactly right. Housing issues, transportation issues, job creation issues, public safety issues, education, all issues all provide a potentially fertile turf for the Republican Party in California. But as long as the party is perceived as being so angry and holding so much animosity toward immigrants, and particularly toward undocumented immigrants, none of those issues are going to be heard. I'll defer to many others on this point as the token angry white male, but my suspicion is a Republican candidate is not going to be held by the voters that heard by the voters we've been talking about on issues of transit, on issues of affordable housing, on issues of school choice, as long as that voter thinks that politician thinks that family's voter is something less than human.
That's absolutely right. In fact, we spent a significant amount of money, we've talked about this before, Marisa, on something we called the California Republican Project, figuring out what is wrong with the Republican brand in California. Is there an opportunity to resonate with voters? And it showed on policy issues that opportunity is there. And the fact that the Republicans are letting the Democratic caucuses lead right now on issues of housing and stuff is a total failure. But what it showed is the number one problem is Californians think Republicans don't care about them. And until that dynamic changes and you build trust in the mind of the voters, they're not ready to listen to the policy solutions and offerings that I believe that Republicans have an opportunity to deliver. So they first have to really work on rebuilding trust and demonstrating that we care about people in their communities. Dan's absolutely right about that. That has to be done first, and perhaps simultaneously with the caucuses and the party offering real solutions on issues related to affordability.
But I don't, all due respect, I think that Republicans like John Cox tried to do that, but he didn't actually offer any solutions. He just talked about the problem.
You can't just talk about it.
Right, you have to offer solutions, and I think that, offering some of those solutions is going to cost money. That's pushing Republicans out of their comfort zone in a way that so far the people who are in elected office in California or trying to be haven't been willing to go out and say, yeah, we need to invest here. You know what I mean? Like,
I do.
Because I found covering that campaign frustrating for that reason, because you can't just talk about what's broken if you're running to run the biggest state in the nation. You got to offer some way to fix it.
So this was a real problem in the party and the caucuses when we were doing this project, is some wanted to argue this is just a messaging problem. This is just a branding problem. And so if we start talking about things differently, then we're going to make a lot of headway and we're going to win elections again. Now, talking about different things differently and messaging and using the right language is critical. That's absolutely important. But that in and of itself is insufficient. You also have to have policy substance behind the messages and the rhetoric that you're delivering.
This gentleman in the middle. Oh.
I was just going to say, as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, it's still within the context of the national Republican Party. Right. So no matter what the California Republican Party does, particularly now with the Trump effect, with Trump in office, and with voters not having a lot of time or access to information,
extraordinarily difficult.
It's extraordinarily difficult because of that overarching view of the Republican Party. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes, and I see like 5 more hands, so we'll move through quick.
Yeah.
It was for Kristin. Wasn't there a huge debriefing around 2008, 2009 by the Republican Party about why they're losing to a black man? And they came up with, it sounds like exactly what you're recommending today, to reach out, look friendly, be inclusive, not be so hostile towards these people who demographically are having more and more of the voting public. So they rejected that then and did exactly the opposite. And they got a white nationalist elected who really hates all those people with some vigor, other people. So why do you expect this to go anywhere? I mean, what you're recommending has already been recommended by a large internal group of Republicans doing this big debriefing of the loss.
Yeah, your knowledge is absolutely correct. He's referring to a report that was very substantive that the RNC did, showing a path forward for Republicans across the nation. And they've done nothing with it. In fact, they've turned significantly the other direction. And so it is hard to remain optimistic. That's why many of us are considering Do we need to explore something different? Does it need to be a new party or a new movement? Or can we get back to the fundamentals of that report and try to rebuild from ground zero?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to go in the order I saw the hands come up, so I'm not perfect. I can't see everything at once.
Thank you. Curious if you have any insights on turnout among voters who requested ballots in languages other than English in 2018, if there's any trends to point to increased turnout among them or anything else.
Do you?
I didn't look that up last night.
That's a good question.
You're saying turnout, right?
Yeah.
I don't have those numbers with me. We have them. The only thing that I would caution is there voters that are registered requesting their ballot materials in another language are not. They're not the population of voters that necessarily need of the entire population of voters that need language assistance. It's very specific. It's those voters that knew about it, that specifically are requesting it. So I take a huge caution when I utilize data like that, because it often is misinterpreted by the public. It's just people that are actually choosing to choose it on their form and unaware of it. That makes sense. But I do have some of the data. I just don't have them with me.
They're the most savvy of in-language voters. How about that as a way to?
Yeah.
I'd like to confirm what Kristin said about what happened in District 10. I was one of the thousands of people who went there to canvass.
We hope you all spent a lot of money
For Josh Harder. And we were instructed not only to take absentee ballots, but if the voter hadn't filled it out, to offer to come into the home and, quote, help them fill out that ballot.
And as long as they signed it.
And the reason why I'd like to mention this is in case there are any political consultants in the room, because I'd like to tell you that was an extremely bad idea. So I had
Like
the good
people,
sense.
People did not respond well to that.
I didn't do such a thing. It struck me as an absolutely horrible thing to do. But I was canvassing with the people I'd ridden with. They were perfectly willing to do it.
I agree. But I do appreciate you saying that. Yeah.
We need to have a sensitivity. I mean, I have canvassed and have had people invite me into their home, but that's very different than inviting yourself into their home, right?
This woman in the purple right here has been trying, and then we can go. Yeah.
You've mostly spoken to candidates. What is the changing demographic meaning for initiatives? Like what happened with the rent control or?
Oh, I feel like rent control would be its own
that's
thing.
much
It's a really
trickier.
bad campaign. I think we should just say that failed because it wasn't well. It was not
well-
well written.
it was-
It was not well structured.
It was not well executed.
Yes. I think Schools and Communities First in 2020 will be a much better barometer of how demographic change, because that's going to basically change Prop 13. And if we manage to do that as a state, I think Prop 55 is a much better barometer that we for the first time, or for the second time, but we, Californians voted to tax themselves. That's a big change. If we manage to change Prop 13, I think that speaks to a fundamental shift in how the framing of politics in California
I
is
would
being
also
affected
just
by demographics.
say that I think initiatives are a really different animal if you talk to consultants, and some of the things I brought up about like how I was targeted. I mean, you see these strange bedfellows within initiative campaigns. You see strange enemies, and I think that, to the point about the big tent in Sacramento, it provides a lot of challenges within a party when you have consultants who are, kind of working on opposite sides than they normally would.
I think you're going to see more people start to play in that space, though. Not that they haven't played in that space of special interest, I call it, in the past. But there's an opportunity with initiatives that doesn't currently exist within the candidate election structure. And that is, if you look at a lot of data and reports and analyses, Californians are much more moderate or conservative, for lack of a better word, when it comes to issues than they are with candidates. And so a lot of things that may have been attempted in the legislature before from, say, your moderate Democratic wing or your Republican wing may instead be tried at the ballot now instead of through the legislature. And I would not suggest that's a positive necessarily, but in the absence of an alternative, I think that's where people are going to move.
Yeah. Okay. Her and then gentleman on the back. Will be our last two questions.
Hi. You've excuse me. You've spoken to the role of imputation relying on outdated assumptions about voters. UCLA's Lori Fraser Yoakley's recent book discusses the increasing racial diversification of suburbs, which have been thought of as traditionally white, and she projects that this is going to continue. Given that our political assumptions are slow to acknowledge these changes, what do you think are the implications for reaching out to voters in some of the swing and slightly conservative suburban districts?
I guess the short answer is the data really needs to improve. The data needs to improve. But part of the reason why the data doesn't improve is because nobody asks them to make it better. Well, people ask, but not the campaigns in general. The folks who run campaigns. We have a panel later today where we're going to talk about, the vast majority of the people who run campaigns are the same people who've been running campaigns for the last 20 to 30 years, and they have their secret sauce and they keep doing it over and over again. And I've done work looking at how campaigns are run. I was looking at clean money campaigns across the country in states as different as Maine and Florida, and the political consultants brought in had a white likely voter strategy in Florida, right? So I think until we change the orientation and we actually believe we need to change the electorate and bring people in rather than treating the electorate as fixed, you're not going to have, those folks are never going to get called even if they're in the suburbs. And so I think that shift on both sides of how we do outreach and how we bring people in to the conversation, that needs to change fundamentally. And to do that, you need better data, but you also need different people asking for the data.
Can I see a show of hands how many have looked into the science of anger? So if Trump won because we didn't know how angry they were, it turns one, okay. So it turns out that our professionals that deal with anger, psychotherapists, were tested for their ability to read anger. They're 0% accurate. After they use a metric, they're 95% accurate.
So I don't know how many other people would have raised their hands, but I have studied this. So what I'd suggest to the group is I think what we know, not just as researchers, but as teachers, as parents, is that underneath most angry people are frightened people. That's right. And I think the conversation for another day on a panel with people, these four and somebody much smarter than me, is to talk about how effective political leaders on both sides have found a way to capitalize on that fear. Once again, I'll come back to the point I made earlier. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in this regard too have much more in common than I think either one of them would care to agree with, but both motivated and mobilized very aggrieved portions of the electorate on the basis of the anger/fear that this gentleman alluded to. The challenge going forward, not for a post-mortem discussion, but for another, is identifying and supporting those political leaders that instead of leveraging those fears for political gain, find the voice to reassure frightened people that those fears can be overcome.
And I just though want to name what's underlying the fear, because all the studies that came out of 2016 said that Trump voters were middle income, racially resentful whites. Right, so Diana Mutz's study, so it wasn't economic anxiety, it was somewhat sexism, but if you look at what motivated people's vote was racial resentment and fear of change. And so until we address that part, and if you look at 2018, that was successful. When Trump brought those fears out again, it was very successful, and that's what happened in Florida, and that's part of what happened in Georgia. So we need to really address those fears of resentment or the underlying resentment and figure out how to address that, because otherwise, it's not just anger, it's anger in a very particular frame.
And then if I may, just really quickly, the flip side also, because I think you were also, Dan, alluding to, correct me, but the fear that folks feel on the other side of the spectrum in terms of voting because of Trump, because of the policies that he has. And that's really real, right? So that type of fear.
Well, right, that's a different, that's kind of to what you talked about 187 and the grassroots movement that came out of that, which was initially fear, but became something more hopeful, I would.
So Marisa, I've taken off my microphone, so I'd offer this real quick. If you think about two frightened groups of voters, one group of voters that, toward Mindy's point, fears that they are being unjustifiably deprived of their share of the American dream, and another share of equally frightened voters who believe that the American dream that they believed in is being taken away from them. Lisa's point is exactly the right one. You address those fears directly, and you overcome them.
And I was just making a quick point about policy, basically. So for many folks that voted against Trump or came out because of his policies, you know, in 2016 it was the fear of the rhetoric that was used and the fear of what might happen. In 2018 it was, for many people, living with the impact of the policies in their lives and their communities. And so to overcome that actually does really, for those folks, require real policy change
and maybe hope.
Yeah, so, yeah.
All right, thank you guys. This was awesome.
We have to take a brief break before the next panel. There are refreshments outside the sponsors who bought you the refreshments. Our gold sponsors, California Association of Realtors, KP Public Affairs. Blue sponsors, Keller Benvenuti, Nielsen Merckxheimer, San Diego Gas and Electric, Southern California Gas, and UFCW Western States Council. We'll start again at 11 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.